everyone. Welcome to the Saint John Vianney Center's podcast, Journey to Thrive. My name is Michael Joseph Groark, and I serve here at the Saint John Vianney Center as a member of the clinical team as a spiritual care advisor, as together we shepherd our brothers and sisters in ministry towards health and healing in body, mind, and spirit. Today, I'd like to talk for just a little bit about the field of positive psychology and how it can help us recruit and maintain flourishing vocations. My goal for this presentation is simply to introduce you to the field of positive psychology and to hopefully offer a compelling framework, language, and vision for initial discernment and subsequent formation of our candidates, with the goal being that we produce and attract more resilient, happy, durable, and flourishing vocations. Obviously, for today's purposes, I'm only going to provide a 30,000-foot view of some of the key research and domains that I think can be helpful for this sacred ministry that we have as vocation directors and formators. First and foremost, I'd like to introduce you to the founder or the pioneer of this field of research, Dr. Martin Seligman, who, believe it or not, at 80 years old, still teaches this stuff at the University of Pennsylvania. Back in 1998, he had been serving as the president of the American Psychological Association for 25 years. And in 1998, he gathers all of the APA together, and he was to go on stage and give his presidential address, where typically they kind of lay out their priorities as they lead this organization. And Martin Seligman took this opportunity to call for a complete revolution in the field of psychology. So I'd like to offer just a brief snippet of the presidential address that he gave 25 years ago. Dr. Seligman said, "One area that cries out is what I call positive psychology. That is a reoriented science that emphasizes and the understanding and building of the most positive qualities of an individual: optimism, courage, work ethic, future-mindedness, interpersonal skills, the capacity for pleasure and insight, and social responsibility. It is my belief that since the end of World War II, psychology has moved too far away from its original roots, which were to make the lives of all people more fulfilling and productive, and too much toward the important but not all important area of curing mental illness." So he's kind of inviting the field of psychology to take another look at the other side of the human spirit. I'd like to offer you two other brief definitions to help orient ourselves to what this field is concerned with. Human beings are not fundamentally problems to be solved, rather they are gifts to be nourished. That quote comes from yours truly. So again, is my belief that positive psychology has a completely different starting point and premise, specifically when we're talking in anthropological language. And I believe that positive psychology is pretty compelling, especially when looking at a Catholic anthropological system. Said another way, treating mental illness is not the same thing as promoting mental well-being. Also me. So here's one way we can kind of envision how positive psychology and traditional psychology mix and mingle and work together and complement one another. So if this number chart here from -10 to +10 is an individual's kind of life. So they present somewhere, clinic, let's say, and they're -10. They're mentally unwell. They've got traumas, anxieties, depression, whatever's going on with them. Traditional psychology is the life-saving component of this. So through psychotherapy and different interventions, perhaps pharmacological interventions, we bring this individual back to baseline, maybe a little above baseline. We get them back to enjoying life again in society. Positive psychology steps in and says, that's great. Now we want to find those parts of your life that aren't -10. Certainly something's right around baseline, and we want to push you towards flourishing. So really, positive psychology just fills out this psychological profile for the people that we serve. Different emphasis. Positive psychology is the study of the good life, the positive facets of the human experience, and what makes people flourish and life most worth living. What I find really interesting about this field is Martin Seligman et al. Decided to look back through the centuries to all of the wisdom writings and wisdom teachers and religious texts, philosophers, to say, what is the good life? And we've studied that, and now we can actually quantify that through science and research. And so it really fits in well with our Catholic tradition. What positive psychology is not. We are not self-help gurus. We certainly are not promoting happyology. However, we do study happiness, and we'll talk about that in just a second. We do not believe in a Pollyannish worldview or promoting good vibes only. And certainly what we're very aware of as practitioners is keeping an eye out for what we call toxic positivity. And this is when people kind of are a little too happy and optimistic all the time. And what happens is they deny or minimize the full human spectrum of emotions and experiences. So authentic positive psychology certainly makes room for things that are not so happy. We'll talk about that a little later on too. So there's basically two traps that I hear repeated often when I talk to vocation directors. One is we are so jaded by the mistakes of the past and the present that we are kind of hypersensitive to the red flags. So we kind of have this bias going into our conversations that's going to affect what we hear and what we say to our candidates. So we're kind of a little too sensitive about what's wrong. The other end of this spectrum is we just kind of let anybody in. And then we say, well, formation will weed them out or fix them or whatever. And I think both of these are traps, but we can fall into either one of these camps pretty easily. So I'm trying to offer kind of a third way to think about our ministry. So again, today is just a new lens and hopefully a new language for your ministry. I take my cue from St. Irenaeus, who said the glory of God is the human person fully alive, and that is what positive psychology aims to promote, is the human person fully alive. To that end, when Dr. Seligman launched this theory of positive psychology, he put forward a framework, and that's where I'd like to work from today and offer you a new language. So this model that Dr. Seligman devised is called PERMA. That stands for positive emotions, engagement with life and activities, relationships, meaning, which is the existential piece, and then accomplishment. So I'm going to kind of, again, just touch on a few of these domains. Of course, there's a whole host of research that falls out from each of these categories, but for today, we're just going to kind of skim the surface. So when we talk about positive emotions, remember I said we're not happyologists? Well, we do study happiness theories. Happiness is an important part of life, so we want to find out how our candidates approach pleasure and happiness and these positive emotions. So within these theories of happiness, of course, there's different models. The first one we might be aware of is the hedonic model. That's where we get the word hedonism. Of course, this is going back again to the philosophers. So hedonic well-being refers to the aspect of happiness that is focused on pleasure, enjoyment, and the avoidance of pain or discomfort. So again, we all need this hedonic well-being in our life. We like to have a good steak dinner from time to time. This is hedonic happiness. It emphasizes the subjective experiences like positive emotions of joy, excitement, life satisfaction, but also the absence of negative feelings like stress or sadness. So this is rooted in hedonic psychology. It's often measured through self-reports of mood or pleasure from activities or overall contentment. For example, savoring a good meal or feeling accomplished after a tough workout can contribute to our hedonic well-being. Now, it's distinct from what we're going to talk about next. That's the eudaimonic model, which centers more on meaning and purpose. Critics of this hedonic model argue that it can be fleeting, and this is true. What happens is we find that people get on what we call the hedonic treadmill. So with these kind of transitional pleasures. They come and go, and people spend their life chasing these momentary glimpses of happiness, and they can never truly be satisfied. So while it's important to our overall subjective well-being, it's not all important. So the next model, of course, is the eudaimonic model, coming from Aristotle. This model focuses on living a meaningful, purposeful life aligned with one's values and potential. So, rooted in Aristotelian philosophy, it emphasizes self actualization, personal growth, and contributing to something greater than oneself. So, it's less about those fleeting pleasures and more about fulfillment through virtue, relationships, and achievements. For example, pursuing a calling or helping others, altruism, or mastering a skill that can foster eudaimonic well-being. Again, it's often measured by assessing purpose and autonomy and self-acceptance. Unlike the hedonic model, which prioritizes pleasure, eudaimonic well-being can involve effort or struggle, but it leads to a deeper, lasting satisfaction of life. And then a relatively new but compelling model within this happiness domain is called psychological richness, which we say goes beyond meaning and happiness. This theory was devised by Professor Oishi. I believe he teaches at the University of Chicago. Psychological richness refers to a dimension of well-being characterized by a life filled with diverse, novel, and perspective-shifting experiences that stimulate deep emotions and personal growth. So unlike the hedonic model, which is pleasure-focused, or eudaimonic well-being, which is purpose-driven, psychological richness emphasizes variety, complexity, and emotional depth. Now, here's the key. Even if the experiences aren't always positive. For example, traveling to a new culture, facing a challenging situation, or engaging in profound conversations can enhance psychological richness because it broadens one's worldview. It's measured by the range and intensity of experiences that lead to new insights and changed perspectives. So this model really highlights curiosity and openness to life's ups and downs, and we see a lot of like cognitive flexibility built into this model. You might think of this like when you're on your deathbed, you don't want to regret things you didn't get to do. That's a psychologically rich life, even if it isn't always good feeling. But we also study things like optimism, love, serenity, hope, and my favorite, gratitude, which we'll talk about in just a second. Now, why are positive emotions so important to call out, to identify, and to encourage in our candidates? Well, because our brains have this funny little thing called a negativity bias. Our brains evolved this way. Long time ago, our ancestors had to be very aware of threats and dangers in their environment. So unfortunately, our brains have a lot more neural activity going on that's looking for things that are wrong in our lives and in our environment. So it's really important that we promote these positive emotions to kind of combat this negativity bias. We do this typically through tools like cognitive behavioral therapy, but this affects pretty much everything, including the way we think about life, reality, and the things that happen to us. So one of the first things Dr. Seligman came up with was what he calls explanatory styles. How do we explain the things that happen to us? So there's basically two categories, pessimistic, optimistic. So when something happens to the pessimist, of course, this will last forever. It's permanent. It's pervasive. This is going to undermine and undo everything, right? They kind of catastrophize, universalize. It's personal. This is all me. It's all my fault. And it's uncontrollable. There's nothing I can do about it. And this is rooted in his research about learned helplessness. Nothing I can do will change my situation. When we get stuck in this learned helplessness model, we fall into this like perpetual victimhood. So we want to be very aware of how our candidates and our formandi explain reality and the things that happen to them. The optimist, on the other hand, everything's temporary. This too shall pass. Everything's local. It relates to just this one situation. They don't personalize. This is not entirely my fault, and it's controllable. There's something I can do about this. So not only are optimists more resilient generally, but they have an enhanced sense of agency. So this is kind of the antidote to learned helplessness. And this is really important because, as Dr. Seligman says, whether or not we have hope depends on two dimensions of our explanatory style: pervasiveness and permanence. So I think we want candidates that have a profound sense of hope and are always able and willing to offer an account for their hope. But if everything that happens to them will last forever and will undo everything that they've ever done, it's going to be hard to have hope. So we want to be listening carefully for how they explain their worlds. And then my favorite emotion, if you will, positive emotion that falls within this first domain is gratitude. You would be surprised how many priests and religious, when they come into my office for spiritual direction, and I ask them, what are you most grateful for? The kind of funny stares I get and the struggle they have with trying to come up with even 2 or 3 things good that have happened to them. One of the most studied interventions in positive psychology is called the 3 blessings exercise. This is where people are asked, I do it with all of my residents, to simply keep a journal of 3 good things that happen to them each day. And what happens over time is we kind of start to help our brain overcome that negativity bias. And it's like cognitive priming. So once we become aware of good things that are happening, then we start to look for these blessings. So we're not looking for threats anymore. We're looking for God's blessings in our lives. So this is really, really important to encourage our candidates to reflect on moments of joy in prayer and gratitude in their service or their community. Gratitude journaling is a very helpful exercise, and it gets them able to speak about what they're thankful for. But there's a very important Catholic element to this too, right? Because the most powerful prayer that we have as a church is the Mass. And right at the center of this most powerful prayer is the Eucharistic prayer. And right in the middle of that prayer comes this: it is truly right and just. It is our duty and our salvation always and everywhere to give you thanks. So gratitude and salvation are intimately entwined. And so it's really important that when we're talking to our candidates, they're able to see and express profound gratitude. Now we move on to engagement. This refers to being fully absorbed in activities that align with one's strengths and passions. For candidates, deep engagement with prayer or ministry or theological studies can help clarify their sense of calling. And some of the first pioneering research that came from Martin Seligman and his team is what's called character strengths and virtues. This is really cool research. So this is a strength-based and virtue-based model of doing discernment and formation. Dr. Ryan Niemiec is the president of the VIA Institute, which is Values in Action. He says character strengths are positive traits existing in degrees that are reflected in our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and our predispositions towards moral excellence. So just like traditional psychology has done the work and created the DSM manual, right, of everything that's wrong, well, Dr. Seligman says we want to do the same thing, but for everything that's right in humanity. What's the best in human beings? So they sent out a team of researchers and scientists to the farthest ends of the world. They visited indigenous, hidden cultures, third world, developed world. They went everywhere for several years, and they spent time interviewing people in all of these cultures to find out what is the best in human beings, in your cultures, in your societies. Not only that, but then Dr. Seligman and his team took all of this wisdom literature. We're talking writings of Benjamin Franklin and the philosophers and the Bible, New and Old Testaments, all these religious texts, and they pumped them through computers to extract all character and virtue language. And then they synthesized all of this data, and they found some pretty interesting results. So it turns out that They were able to distill 6 overarching virtues that kind of are universal. They're ubiquitous. So wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence. And then within, or stemming from or flowing from each of these 6 overarching virtues are 24 character strengths that we believe are present in pretty much every human being to a greater or lesser degrees. So the cool thing about this is we say character strengths give us a common language about the human experience. So this gives us a common language to talk about what's best in us and in one another. So this is really important. So with our candidates, I would highly recommend when you're discerning with them or doing further formation, you help them to identify their strengths and then encourage them to live out of them intentionally. And what the research shows is that when people live their strengths in an intentional, purposeful way every single day, they are significantly happier with life. So we want happy candidates. And it turns out that Aristotle was also correct with his golden mean theory of virtues. So just like the virtuous life, with each of these strengths, they can fall into overuse or excess, underuse, where you don't find the virtue or you don't find the full force of this character strength. So we want to find that golden mean, that sweet spot for each of these strengths. Again, when I teach this class, I teach it in about a week. So you're getting just a 30,000-foot view of what's going on here. But in the meantime, I like to show this picture. Now, I normally do this as like a guided meditation to show the importance of each of these strengths. So if you're listening to this, you know yourself pretty well. Look at this wonderful list of character strengths: leadership, spirituality, love, gratitude, appreciation of beauty, honesty, right? So these are all operative in each one of us to a greater or lesser degree. So I ask people during these workshops to kind of pick one that they think they use a lot naturally, that gives them life when they express this particular character strength, and to think about how this strength has kind of helped you, has made your life better, has made you happier, holier, how it has worked in your relationships, in your ministries, and really just kind of spend a moment like saying thank you to this part of yourself, this gift that God has given you. And then I ask them to imagine that I am able to reach into your soul and just pluck that out of you. You're not able to use or express that strength for one whole month. What would that be like? Imagine if you couldn't express gratitude or spirituality or love for an entire month. I think we'd all agree that our lives would be pretty miserable. So this is really important to identify what's going on inside of us and to live out of our strengths in a more intentional way. So if you're interested, you can go to viacharacter.org. It is a free survey, so you can do this with your candidates, help them to identify their strengths. And what you'll see on their report is each of us has a unique constellation of each of these 24 strengths operating within us to a higher or lesser degree. However, each one of us has a unique constellation of the top 5, what we call our signature strengths. So these are the strengths that we use so naturally and organically that we don't even notice we're doing them. And so the point is, if we can encourage our candidates to really be intentional and focused on their signature strengths every day, they will be noticeably happier, more resilient, more optimistic in life. So viacharacter.org. And relationships. We're not going to spend too much time here because I think we all agree that communion and relationships and being part of the beloved community is just natural to us, I hope, as Catholics and as religious. But relationships are super important for well-being. Strong, supportive relationships are critical in the discernment process, as candidates need this sense of community or mentorship and accountability to grow in their vocation. So we're not going to dwell on this too long, but this is good criteria, right? If we're discerning with people or offering retreats, using a PERMA model, to focus on this relationship domain. How are your relationships? How are you building them? What's working? What's not? I can tell you that some of the things we've already talked about are really important to our research on positive relationships, like gratitude, being able to um, freely express gratitude to other people is a key indicator of healthy relationships. And what we just talked about with character strengths. Like I said, that research gives us a common language about humanity. And so, in our conversations and relationship building, we can do what's called strength spotting. So, once we kind of know our own strengths, then we can start to look for those same strengths in other people and call them out. Say, this takes our conversation beyond surface level to a much more intense, deep, meaningful level with one another. So, boy, that presentation you gave today, I saw that you used your strengths of creativity and courage, and I just want to say I saw that within you, and I want to emulate that. That's going to build relationships much better than just surface level relating. And then, of course, we study things like positive communication. So, active listening, active constructive responding. So, pay attention to how our candidates, listen and respond when we're discerning with them and how they're operating in our communities. This will be a very good indicator as to their capacity for growing positive relationships. And then maybe my favorite domain here is the meaning piece. This is really, really important. This is the existential positive psychology. So we want to help our candidates connect their discernment to a larger purpose rooted in serving God and the church. Why is this important? Well, because when they first arrive on our doorsteps and we start discerning with them, they're usually very zealous and on fire, and they present as if they have a very clear understanding of their ultimate why. But sometimes, as we've also seen on our end here, that kind of falls out sometimes when life gets real, when formation gets tough, or they get burnt out in ministry. That initial why kind of becomes a little slippery, and then they get into these existential crises. Okay, so we want to keep our finger on the pulse of this constantly throughout their formation. One of the people we claim is kind of the proto-positive psychologist is Dr. Viktor Frankl, who of course wrote many, many books, but Man's Search for Meaning or The Will to Meaning. So he was very involved in this existential exploration. So Frankl, of course, in Man's Search for Meaning says those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. So we want to help our candidates discover their why, because when ministry gets tough, when life gets hard, they need to have something solid to stand on, and then they can endure anyhow. And then again, he says when a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure. Again, that's a big problem for people in ministry down the road when they get burnt out. So we want to be sure that they have their ultimate why for why they're doing this vocation. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but these are questions that I use with candidates that you may or may not find compelling. So we might want to ask them, what experiences in your life have made you feel most alive or connected to a deeper purpose? How do you understand your place in the world, and what do you feel called to contribute to it? When have you felt closest to God or the divine or sense of ultimate truth? What was happening in that moment? Get them to speak to these God moments. What challenges or struggles have shaped your understanding of why you are here? We might ask them, how do you find peace or purpose in the face of life's uncertainties or mysteries? This is a really good question. It helps them kind of live in the perhaps, the unknown, the memento mori, looking at mortality in their life, rather than candidates who are very certain about God, the universe, and everything else. Who or what inspires you to be more than you are today, and why? Who are these paragons in your life, and why? How do you discern when something feels right or aligned with your deepest sense of self? And if you were to look back on your life many years from now, what would make you feel like it was a life well lived? So these are just a few existential questions that may be helpful in your ministry. And then we come to accomplishment. So again, we want to support our candidates in setting and achieving goals related to their discernment and formation, building confidence, and a sense of progress. So this is really focused on goals, which can build confidence and momentum as they're discerning and subsequent formation. For candidates, even small victories in personal growth can affirm or detract from their path if it's not there. So when I usually present this in Catholic circles, sometimes I get a pushback about we can't be too proud of our accomplishments because we need humility, and that sounds a lot like pride. Okay, we need to make some distinctions here. So we're talking about authentic pride versus hubristic pride. Okay, so psychology distinguishes between authentic pride, which stems from genuine accomplishments and a positive self image, versus hubristic pride, which is characterized by the inflated ego and a need for external validation. Authentic pride is associated with high self-esteem and a genuine feeling of self-worth, while hubristic pride is linked to low self-esteem because it's linked to this need for external validation. So healthy pride, authentic pride, is linked with the virtue of humility. It's balanced with humility because it allows us to recognize our own strengths and weaknesses, as well as the contribution of others in what we might have done right or well. It acknowledges that success is often a collaborative effort and there's always room for growth and learning. So we want to promote things like SMART goals when we're doing this initial discernment, right? Give them specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound activities. This is really important because they need to feel like they were looking to do something, they did something, they can be proud of it in a healthy, authentic way. So it can be as simple as, I need this autobiography done by next Monday for your vocation packet, or you will attend this retreat next month, right? Gives them these markers to look forward to accomplish, and then to kind of celebrate these little incremental marks towards the fullness of their vocation. And underneath achievement in this goal model, we need to talk about motivations, right? And this is good. So these next couple of pieces as we wrap up here are things to be listening for when we're talking and discerning with our candidates, and certainly as they move forward in the formation process. Are our candidates intrinsically or extrinsically motivated? And I think when you start listening for this stuff, you'll hear it one way or the other more often. When discerning religious life, candidates weigh intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, which shape their decision to pursue a vocation like priesthood, religious life, etc. So, intrinsic motivation is driven by internal desires, such as a personal call from God, love for the spiritual life, or a deep yearning to serve others in faith. The pros of intrinsically motivated people is this sustains their commitment through challenges, as the motivation is rooted in personal faith and spiritual fulfillment. Intrinsic motivation fosters authenticity in their discernment. It aligns with a true vocation rather than external pressures, and it encourages resilience as candidates are driven by a sense of divine purpose. On the other side of this, when we hear this extrinsic motivation talk come up, extrinsic motivation is driven by external factors such as societal expectations, family encouragement, or the prestige of being in a religious role. So you might have people who are pursuing religious life to fulfill their parents' hopes or a cultural tradition. In some communities where priesthood or religious are more highly esteemed, they might be seeking the structure and security of religious life as an escape from worldly pressures or personal struggles. And they might be drawn into the more visible roles of priest and religious life, so that kind of status piece. So we want to be listening for that. However, there are some pros here for extrinsic motivation. It can initially draw candidates to explore a vocation that they might not have otherwise explored. And external affirmations from mentors or communities or families can provide clarity during initial discernment. The cons, of course, to extrinsic motivation is that it risks inauthentic vocations if the candidate's heart isn't aligned with the sacrifices of religious life and priesthood. It could lead to disillusionment when the external rewards kind of fall off and it doesn't match the reality of the vowed life or the priestly life. And extrinsic motivation can foster dependency on approval, which can undermine the self-giving nature of an authentic calling. And so, really, when we're discerning with our candidates, we want to find kind of a healthy balance between the extrinsic and intrinsic. Intrinsic motivation is critical for the lasting, durable vocation, as religious life demands personal conviction to endure the sacrifices that they make. Extrinsic factors can spark interest but should not dominate. So, in the discernment process, spiritual directors and vocation programs can help candidates distinguish between intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. You can use tools like retreats or Ignatian discernment or journaling even to clarify whether the call is rooted in God's invitation or external pressures. So a true vocation often blends intrinsic motivation with healthy extrinsic supports, but the intrinsic must always lead. Ultimately, a vocation to priesthood or religious life thrives on intrinsic motivation, which is a heart turned toward God, while extrinsic factors can serve as an initial catalyst or affirmations, but should not be the foundations. So individuals with healthy pride are intrinsically motivated to achieve their goals and make a positive impact. They see their accomplishments as a reflection of their efforts and their capabilities, fueling their desire for continuous improvement. Following on with achievements and accomplishments, we need to talk about kind of how they think. So there's two models here. There's a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. Again, we want to be listening for this kind of stuff when we're discerning. So healthy pride embraces the idea that one's abilities and intelligence can be developed through effort and learning. This allows individuals to view challenges as opportunities for growth and learning rather than as failures and setbacks. So we're going to look here at fixed mindset versus growth mindset. And this growth mindset research was really taken on by a psychologist named Carol Dweck, if you're interested in reading more about this. And she describes two different approaches to personal development, to challenges, and to continued learning. When applied to people discerning religious life, such as pursuing a vocation to priesthood or religious orders, these mindsets can significantly shape their discernment process, their spiritual growth, and their response to challenges. So we're going to look at the two. First, a growth mindset is characterized by the belief that abilities, understanding, and spiritual maturity can develop through effort, through learning, and openness to God's grace. Individuals with a growth mindset embrace challenges, they learn from their setbacks, and they see discernment as a dynamic journey. So people with a growth mindset will approach discernment as a process of growth, trusting that God's call will become clearer through prayer, reflection, and experience. They're open to exploring perhaps different religious communities or dioceses or charisms or vocations without feeling locked into one path prematurely. And they will see uncertainty or doubt as a natural part of spiritual exploration, not as a sign of failure. And then when challenges inevitably arise in their vocation, they embrace these difficulties, such as feelings of unworthiness or fears of sacrifice or external skepticism from family or friends, as opportunities for them to deepen their trust in the Lord. They're willing to work through personal struggles like attachments or doubts or past sins with spiritual direction, with confession, and with prayer. And they learn from feedback well. So growth mindset people actively seek guidance from spiritual directors, vocation directors, formators, and they view their input as a way to grow. They're open to constructive criticism, such as advice to develop their virtues like patience or humility. They see this as part of healthy formation. When setbacks arise, growth mindset people will see rejection from a religious community or a sense of, quote, not fitting in as a redirection from God, not as a personal failure. They trust that setbacks are part of God's plan to prepare them for their true calling. As far as spiritual growth goes, they believe that holiness is a lifelong journey. It's achievable through cooperation with God's grace rather than an innate quality that they must already possess or not. So they embrace formation as a transformative process to grow in virtue and to align better with God's will. And within religious life, they're adaptable to the challenges of religious life, such as obedience or community living or unexpected ministries. They're more resilient in facing spiritual dryness or doubts. They trust in God's presence. And they're committed to lifelong learning and growing in the faith, which aligns with the ongoing formation that's required for this way of life. Now, on the other side of this is the fixed mindset. So we want to be listening for this too. A fixed mindset is characterized by the belief that abilities, worthiness, or spiritual readiness are static and unchangeable. Individuals with this mindset may see their suitability for religious life as predetermined. This can lead to rigidity, fear of failure, or avoidance of challenges. So when fixed mindset people start to discern, they're going to view discernment as like a quest to prove that they're already worthy or certain of their vocation rather than a journey of discovery. They may fixate on one specific path and resist exploring alternatives, fearing that it shows indecision. And they see uncertainty or doubt as a sign that they are, quote, not cut out for religious life or priestly life. When challenges arise, they'll avoid or they'll feel overwhelmed by difficulties, such as fear of sacrifice, family objections, or personal weaknesses, viewing them as evidence of inadequacy. They may give up on discernment if it feels too hard or requires significant change. When feedback to them arises, they resist guidance or constructive criticism, fearing that it exposes their unworthiness or their lack of readiness. These people may avoid spiritual direction or vocational discernment programs, afraid that they might be found out that they're unfit. When setbacks arise, they interpret rejection from a diocese or a religious community or general struggles in discernment as proof that they're not called or not good enough. They may abandon discernment altogether after a single setback, believing that it confirms their fixed limitations. As far as spiritual growth goes, they believe holiness or readiness for religious life is something they either have or don't have rather than something they can grow and cultivate. They may feel discouraged if they don't immediately feel holy or experience deep consolations in prayer. And within religious life, they have difficulty adapting to the demands of this way of life, such as obedience or community living, believing that they just can't change. There's a risk of discouragement during formation where growth in virtues and self-awareness is a requirement. And they have a tendency to compare themselves to others. For example, I'm not as holy as so-and-so, and this can lead them to spiral into envy or despair. And so, in summary, I believe that the PERMA model equips priests and vocation directors with a comprehensive framework to nurture candidates' vocational call, their well-being, and to prepare them for a life of service to the church. So to end here, I'd like to give you just a few practical implementations for vocation directors. You can assess all of this stuff. There's tools, there's assessments online for most of this stuff to look at our candidates' well-being across this PERMA spectrum, and we can identify areas of strength and areas needed for growth. Very good website out there is positivepsychology.com. You can find a whole bunch of literature and ways to kind of identify this stuff. Tailored support. Create individualized discernment plans that address these PERMA needs, such as pairing a candidate struggling with relationships with a mentor or offering resources for those seeking meaning. Let's build some workshops and retreats, design programs that incorporate this PERMA language, workshops on finding joy in ministry, or retreats for deeper prayer or team building activities, etc. And ongoing formation, right? This is part of, remember those 4 pillars? So this is the human formation piece that sometimes gets a little lost. So if we can kind of boost up that human formation piece, I promise you'll have healthier, happier, more durable, more resilient candidates. So we want to keep our finger on the pulse of their overall well-being throughout their formative process. There's our boy, Pope Leo. So benefits for vocation directors. That's a holistic approach. This is going to touch on their emotional, spiritual, and practical needs, which will lead to a more thorough discernment. Builds more resilient people. By fostering well-being, directors can help candidates develop resilience needed for the demands of priesthood and religious life. You'll have greater retention. Candidates who feel seen and supported and fulfilled are more likely to persevere. And alignment with mission. It aligns with the church's emphasis on human flourishing. It's a Catholic anthropology at work here, helping directors form priests who are joyful, engaged, and purpose-driven. And some final thoughts and considerations. Be aware of cultural sensitivities here. Adapt the PERMA applications to respect their cultural backgrounds, because things like emotions or expressions of emotions or community and relationships may vary wildly. It's about balance. Ensure the model complements rather than overshadows the spiritual and theological aspect of discernment. And it address potential obstacles such as their fear of vulnerability in relationships or external pressures like family or society expectations, which may hinder their well-being. And people sometimes ask for kind of a starter pack for positive psychology. So if this is interesting to you, you want to learn more and incorporate more of this lens and language into your ministry as vocation directors, formators, these are 3 texts that I highly recommend. Learned Optimism by Dr. Seligman, Flourish by Dr. Seligman, and The Resilience Factor, which is going to get more into that cognitive behavioral piece about how we think about life and things that happen to us to form more resilient candidates. So I hope you found this information helpful on positive formation. You can tune into any of our Journey to Thrive podcasts on our website at sjvcenter.org. Click on resources or anywhere you get your podcasts. Thank you and God bless.